Hello everyone and welcome back to another automation guide. Today we are doing the American 2000s. Um I'd say there's nothing really of to point out other than really we're almost at the technological peak. We are very much almost at the technological peak. The 2010s really is technological peak, but 2000s is like right there, especially because like the early 2000s is very 90s, and then like the mid 2000s is very technological, and still gets a little different, but samey during the when was it 2008 economical crisis. The cars really didn't change, but they were affected, not in the way you think, like majorly, but they were okay. They were still price stuff. Body style. Anything blobject in the early 2000s, and then in the mid 2000s, it looks pointy because that's really how it was. Because it was really early mid 2000s, I'd say, was the pointy. Because a lot of the cars from the 90s carried over to the 2000s, like every other decade. So it's blob. And then once they actually got the new facelift or anything like that, it looked sharp. Panel material, still treated steel. I looked everywhere to see if any car used partial aluminum or aluminum. The only thing I could find was like a muscle car might use partial aluminum, like the Challenger, the Mustang. I don't think the Camaro did, but they used some sort of aluminum. And the pickup trucks, like a Ford F-150, had an aluminum bed. Those were the only things I could find that were aluminum. So I guess just regular treated steel. Of course, unibody, chassis type, chassis material, corrosion resistant steel. AHS still isn't making a thing. Uh, engine train, engine placement, front transverse, of course. There was one car. What was it? The GM with the Sigma platform, which was the Cadillac CTS and the CTS-V and stuff like that. They had that for quite a while. The Sigma platform. It was front engine, front longitudinal, rear wheel drive, stuff like that, instead of front transverse, front wheel drive, like every other car. Front suspension, McPherson strut or double wishbone. Um, yeah, double wishbone luxury. So it's just always goes McPherson strut if it's luxury or sporty, double wishbone. And then rear suspension, you could actually use just about anything. It was, I'd say, start on economy cars like the Cobalt with the torsion beam. I said that. I actually said this last time. The 90s cars didn't have any torsion beams. Cars still use torsion beams in the 90s. Even, like I said, in the 2000s, the Cobalt had a torsion beam, the Neon. Um, Basically, yeah. And then it's kind of like a tier. It's like torsion beam at the bottom, then semi-trailing arm, then double wishbone, then multi-link. But even compact cars still use multi-link, like the Ford Focus. It used multi-link, and it was compact. So, but it's sort of a tier list, I'd say. Just keep on it, you know. But most of the time, it was just something like that. Engines. Engine blocks, inline fours and V6, of course. GM made the quirky i5, the Atlas inline 5, for the Colorado and the H3, which is of course, truck and an SUV, in the Bel Air concept. They made a Bel Air concept in like 2003, 2004. It's very interesting, and they put the inline 5 because of two. Oh, that was another thing in the 2000s. There was sort of a retro revival, like with the Chrysler PT Cruiser, the Chevy HHR, and they were going to make the Bel Air. Sort of a retro revival. That's one thing I should have very much point out. And of course, like I said, they were either inline fours or V6s. There was an inline five, but that was a concept. But like maybe if you want to, because it was the GM Atlas was an inline six, and then they had that inline five. They chopped the cylinder off or something like that. So it could be something like that as an excuse for an inline five. You could probably do that the whole time, but yeah, I don't need to tell you that. Of course, block material. Some blocks were still made of cast iron, but had aluminum heads. Because of course, head materials were still aluminums. Because in this decade, just about every car was all aluminum now, or every engine was now all aluminum because of how lightweight you can make it, how easier it was to manufacture, and stuff like that. Or aluminum alloy. I don't know if I went over this last time, but Alcy aluminum silicone, I would say that might be aluminum alloy, but it's not, because aluminum silicone's an actual thing that, like, Mercedes, I think, used. It's not, it's an actual real aluminum silicone thing. I don't know how else to describe it. It's aluminum silicone, and it's not aluminum alloy. It's fully its own thing. Maybe use that if aluminum alloy. I don't know. But yeah, aluminum alloy was used because aluminum alloy was used more than regular aluminum, just because it was a lot easier to get the aluminum to their own thing. And of course, forged cranks are starting to see use more every engine, improve durability and reduce weight, especially turbo engines. I saw a lot of GM engines used forged cranks. I want to say Ford engines as well, but I'm not too sure about Chrysler engines because they had like 3 overall. Of course, the Hemi V8 did, but like regular inline 4s and V6s, I couldn't say about the Dodge. Of course, cast iron. If you put the turbo in there, forged pistons, hypertectic, forged for turbos. And of course, this is the year where turbos were starting to be put onto cars. I'll get onto that in a little bit. Harmonic damper if you're using an inline 4. Of course, you could use a balance shaft if you want to, because that'd go in like a 2 liter and up. Oh, shoot. I missed an entire part. Displacement 1.4 to 2.5 for inline 4s, 3 to 4 liter for a V6, and of course the god-awful North Star was 4.6 liters. This decade saw undersquare designs become normal in inline 4s by 4 millimeters, and V6 designs were still over square by at least a big 8 mil. Of course, undersquare means this is higher, and over square is this is higher. I don't know if I ever explained or said that. I probably didn't. I don't know. Let's see here. Tuning. Now engines were really making almost as much horsepower as they can. If there's a turbo version, it really doesn't have more than 80 horsepower than the NA. Yeah. Because basically this is it's a 3 liter 4-valve. Oh, fuck. I didn't even go over the valves. The valves. Inline 4s were all dual overhead cam 4 valves, while V6s were all finally single overhead cams. A 2, 3, or 4 valves. 2 and 4 are more common. Yes. Because V6s, you could finally get 2 valves, or 3 or 4 in a single cam. I don't think there were any dual cams. They were mostly single cams, and they were either 2 valves for like a cheap V6, or 4 valve for like a big V6. That's what this is. No dual cam V6s yet. Where was I? Right. Engines make almost as much horsepower. Yeah, because this is a 3 liter, 4 valve, single cam V6, making 203 horsepower. That's actually a lot. That's actually more than they would usually make, which is the funny part. But this is a new engine. All the other engines were like ported over from the 90s. And then when they make the new engines, new facelifts, it'll make like 200 some horsepower as well. Turbos. Of course, like I said, this is actually I didn't put anything about turbos. But yeah, this is actually the first year turbos were kind of put into regular economy cars, because there was GM the first to do that. Yeah, I know GM does a lot of things first. They had theirs on the inline 4s. I think on the Ecotech stuff too. A lot of their stuff was A lot of their Ecotech stuff, had inline 4s and or turbos. No, the Ecotech wasn't inline 4. But yeah, it did. yeah, if it did have a turbo version, it didn't make much more horsepower. It had like 80 at the max, I'm pretty sure. Because I've seen some with like 40, 50 horsepower turbo. And whatever. So it's just because you're tuning it for fuel economy. Because you probably just click that and it'll be good. If you don't know how to do turbo tuning, I know what you mean. Let's see here. Injection, multi-point fuel injection, EFI, which is standard. GM did have some uses of direct injection. Ecotech 1 engines and the North Star. Yes, they did have. It was sort of direct injection, sort of their own direct injection sort of thing. It wasn't. They didn't call it direct injection, but I think it was. It was sort of a. One of them was a sequential fuel injection thing, which is like the midway between the regular multi-point and a direct injection, which automation doesn't have. Which I don't know if you can just kind of like emulate that or actually make that here, but sequential fuel injection's its own thing. It's not an automation. That was like the 2000s sort of thing, but just multi-point EFI is a thing. Or direct injection if you would just want to do that. Config, variable still in and more use. Performance engines were the only ones that have twin or individual throttle bodies. Yeah, if I ever do performance engines, you could finally, it's a twin or individual. We're definitely it. And then, of course, intake, variable or mid. Manifold size, fuel required. Fuel required. Oh, yeah, there was something. Fuel was being replaced by E10 87 AKI by 2006, and it was widely implemented along with E85. And usually, if it was a regular engine, it would just be tuned to this ethanol blend E10. If it was like 2006 and up, but if it was like before that, it would be just regular unleaded 86. And if it was tuned to E85, it would be a completely different engine tune as well, because the way E85 and E10 works, because there's more alcohol than fuel, so it's gonna burn more. So you're gonna have to like tune it a lot differently with like compression and such. There's a whole thing about it. I'm like really making it basic, but yeah. Regular was either gas or E10, and then 91 and 93 AKI are mainly 100% fuel still, yeah. This is by 2006, so I'd say like the mid-2000s, you know. So there's that. Still, like I said, I'm like very much simplifying fuel than what it should be. Let's see here. Config headers, cast mid, or tubulars. There was like one or two things that had tubular headers. They might have been truck engines, because to get that max torque out of it. But some of them did use tubular, but it was probably rare. I did this research ages ago. I wish I still remembered them, but yeah. Cast mid was more than likely it, and then tubulars. Catalytic converters, 3-ways were always the standard high flow for performance. As you can see, I have a 3-way and a pre-cat. Those were pre-catalytic converters. They were actually never mandated. It was just emissions that were mandated, you know, because you could go to here to car emissions and see WES. It doesn't meet WES 11, but you put on a 3-way and cat, it like just fails it. So I'd say whenever I'd say if you actually want to pay attention to this little screen and you actually want to pass in emissions, just start to use a 3-way cat and a pre-cat, you know. Yeah. Because like I said, they were never mandated. They were just kind of put in just to help with emissions. First muffler and second muffler, yes. I don't think I ever mentioned this, but a first muffler I'd recommend being baffled or straight through. And then the second muffler always a reverse flow. Unless you're going with like a super quiet engine, then both are reverse flows. because you still want that airflow for economy and performance, but you still want it quiet, you know. Blah, 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 blah. Alright, and we're here. I never go over these, but there's never any vans or utes, by the way. I feel like that's a little obvious to point out that there were vans or utes, but there were never vans or utes. There's like hatchbacks, still wagons nowadays in the 2000s. You don't make wagons in the 2010s, but yeah. For fixtures, of course, the looks, I'd say, of course, like I said, with the 2000s, in the 90s, carried over to the 2000s, it still looked blobby, round, stuff like that. And in the mid 2000s, it started to look more sharp. I think it kind of started with the with actually the Sigma line, with like the Cadillac DTS, CTS, stuff like that, because I was made a debut in like 03, and they were sharp looking. I'd say this is, I don't know, I'd still say this is like a mid 2000s, and it looks 2000s, but it's like a brand new car, so of course it'd have a brand new look. Drive type, front wheel drive, of course. Some cars like a Ford 500, and that was in the mid 2000s, had an all wheel drive option. So probably keep all wheel drive high, mid to high end. So yeah, cars actually did have all wheel drive in the 2000s. And there's also another thing about all wheel drive. A well, that's actually the differentials. But the drive type for all-wheel drive should be kind of put into its own thing. Like viscous, does it? No, it doesn't say anything about viscous. But one thing I wouldn't recommend is on demand or advanced, because all-wheel drive on demand, of course, is used more in like SUVs and crossovers of the time. Yes, there were some crossovers at the time. Because on demand was like, this wheel gets power, this wheel gets power if there's more grip, these two don't, and this might get a little bit. That's all-wheel drive on demand. So it's super advanced, super technological, and I wouldn't. All-wheel drive advanced, I think, probably works the same way. It doesn't specify what advanced it is. So I'd say just still steer clear out of that. That's more performance. So it either viscous or helical. More than likely, viscous, because it still works like a, as you can see, you gotta have a helical and viscous LSD, because how did they viscous, of course, it had a true all-wheel drive system with like the viscosity stuff in it. Yeah, that's like for low range, low performance stuff. And then the helical was like sort of more high horsepower performance stuff, because it was all gearing and whatnot. And the thing about the differentials, this is actually one thing I would say about the differentials, because I know for sure in one thing, like, this is Japanese, but I'll still give you an example. Like, the Subaru Impreza WRX has a rear LSD and a front open, but the WRX STI, the higher version, has front and rear LSDs. And you can either make it front, and you have to make it front and rear LSD here, but that's neither here nor there. This is an American car. So that's just a little bit of a, I wouldn't say explanation. I didn't explain crap about it, but I did explain just what they would use. Either a viscous or helical all-wheel drive system. The differentials probably would meet the LSDs. If anything, I don't, the helical LSD for all-wheel drive helical, maybe. I'd still say you'd use open, if anything, because LSDs are for, you know, performance, off-roading, stuff like that. And then onto the gearbox. 4-speed automatics were still used somewhat from the last decade, like the god-awful, again, 4L60E. 5-speed automatics started to replace them. Chrysler had a 5-speed auto, and I think Ford had a 5-speed auto somewhere in there. But it was Chrysler that had a 5-speed. And then 5 and 6-speed manuals were optional, because, like I said, automatics were now default by the manufacturer, and you have to option out a manual. Excuse me. Advanced automatic, of course. No auto manual. Porsche had an audio manual, but that's Porsche. Sequential. No, that's like a Lamborghini. Had a gearbox. That's no. Continuous, that is a CVT. And American cars don't use CVTs in the 2000s. Gearing setup, the rear drive, final drive ratio was like 3 to 4, depending on the horsepower. I'd say just kind of look at your 0 to 60, look at your fuel economy, and what's good for the final drive. Spacing was really dependent on the transmission it came with instead of options. So yeah, instead of just like having instead of having actually a set rear drive, it had just one transmission with one option ratio. Because something like this, just 5-speed, every 5-speed would be made in like this instead of having like 2 different configurations. You know, if like a 376 or on this car, and if it was like a bigger car, it'd probably be like a 356 or something. So it was, I think you could still option out the final drive, but it was not good. Not many options, I mean. So the transmissions were sort of, Of course, if you don't know, the basic mode's still pretty good. Differentials, I went over that with transmissions. Tire types, of course, radials. Biggest sidewalls were 60s. Alloy rims were now standard with big bag rims options by mid to late decade. Yes. Alloys were now... I'd say alloys were the standard on just like mid-end cars. If you don't get a base model, you don't get Steelies. Because I know you could get a base Steelies on a Neon or a Cobalt at this time. But the rest of the cars did have alloys by now. Or like I said, big rimmed magnesiums. And of course, 205 60R17s are still there. They're still kind of big sidewalls, but they're still big rims. They were just big tires then because of sporty and whatnot. And of course, tire choice by your choice. Front brakes should be obvious. Front 1 or 2 piston venteds up front. Rear brakes finally saw discs being standardized. Every car had standard rear solid discs by now. I think the only... Well, no, that's a Ford Ranger. It had drum discs in the 2000s, actually. But that's a Ranger, a truck, not a car. So I'd say every car just about had 1 or 2 pistons up front. It didn't really go above 3. SUVs and crossovers had 3 or 4 because big, need more piston. Of course, rear brakes is 1 because it's good enough, you know. It's really good, very good. Under trays, some cars might have used cooling flaps. I think that was more or less a performance thing, using a cooling flap, because description could probably help me. They're electrically actuated flaps to open and close over vents and grills to vary the amount of cooling airflow required. Yeah. Particularly in because they benefit fuel economy in high-powered cars. Because with this, it's only like 0.2 more miles per gallon, which is nothing. So you don't need cooling flaps. So if your car, I'd say if it's a performance car, probably cooling flaps to anything. Under trays, I couldn't find a car with under trays. Maybe... No, 2010s they started to use under trays. Never mind, yeah. Of course, wing. Did I say anything about wing? No wing, yeah. Usually not. Aero package, like I said in the last video, if anything, that had a wing. Sport package had an air. Sport packages usually did have stuff like that, but yeah. Let's see here. CD radios were standard, and some premium cars had a sat-nav infotainment. Yeah. Because, I saw, it was like an early 2000s Ford Explorer, I want to say. It was like the Platinum package, limited package. And it had a sat-nav in it. It was infotainment. And I was like, wow, what's this from? It was 2003. And so, yeah. So probably the big optioned out had sat-navs. If you just did, and it was regular ass CD. Steering, variable hydraulic standard on just about all cars. Japanese cars is really the only country to use electric steering. Even I don't know why I mentioned that, but yeah, Japanese cars had a lot of electric steering. European cars didn't, American cars did. Chevy Cobalt had electric steering. That's like the exception. I think that was like the one car that had electric steering that I could find. There might have been another one, but Chevy Cobalt was basically the only one with electric steering. Probably because it's light enough to where if the power steering fails, you can still just like pull that thing around, light enough to where you can still the steering wheel. Traction aids, ABS standard on all cars, and some cars have started to have ESC standard in the early to mid 2000s. I would say more early than anything, actually. Because the early 2000s, like a Buick, even a 2000 like Buick, it had a ESC on it. So I'd say start putting ESC on stuff if it's like premium. Standard was still standard for some. Progressives for no heavy duty package no more. It was more or less. I would say progressives now are more or less for luxury stuff, if anything, on any cars. Air suspension now luxury oriented, yes. Because, cars still didn't have some sort of air suspension back then. The only cars that did was, I think, the Lincoln Town car, and I want to say some sort of Cadillac had air suspension, but I forgot which one. But basically, yeah, just that, yeah. Dampers, if you're going with a basic car, twin tubes, adaptives, or, of course, use adaptives if you have an electronic suspension more than active sport or active comfort, because that's an actual active suspension system. There's no active suspension systems in American cars in the 2000s yet. So they still had adaptives, or actually maybe semi-actives dampers, because of the adaptive. There's no active suspension yet, so there's like some sort of semi-active dampers. Sway bars were still just passive sway bars. Just regular sway bars. Sport suspension, probably above 1.4 hertz and 3 dampers. Kind of like something like this, probably. The sporty European feel suspension that Motor Week talks about all the time. Took sway bars, standard all around on a lot of cars. I know I've said before, sway bars are still not standard, but they're very much just, yeah. They might as well be at this point. And ride height depends on the suspension package, yeah. A standard suspension package would actually probably be something like this, and some cars had like a sporty suspension. Like a sport package would still be something like that, like low, But if it was just regular, it'd be high, sport low. You get the drift. And that's it. I guess so, yeah. Well, shoot. Okay. Thank you for watching. And of course, again, if you want to look at this, you can. And I guess I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching again.